She whispered one sentence in the quiet hallway, and in that moment, I realized I could never look at her the same way again. It started like any other routine I never questioned. His house was just my friend's place. A familiar stop after classes, after long walks, after days that didn't ask for much meaning. The kind of place where time didn't feel heavy, where you could sit on the couch, scroll your phone, and exist without thinking too deeply about anything. And his mother, she was simply there, like a calm background to that world. Always composed, always graceful in a quiet, effortless way that didn't demand attention, but somehow still held it. I would notice her in fragments. The soft sound of her footsteps on the tiled floor in the mornings. The faint clink of a spoon against a teacup when she stood in the kitchen. The way the scent of cardamom tea slowly filled the house before she even appeared in the room. She spoke gently, with a tone that carried both warmth and control. Not strict, just steady, like someone who had learned how to keep life balanced through patience rather than force. "Beta, have you eaten?" she would ask sometimes, passing by the living room without stopping. And I would answer quickly, almost automatically, because that's what you do in someone else's home. But there were moments I didn't understand even then, moments I didn't know how to categorize. Like when she would pause slightly longer than necessary after speaking to me. Not enough to be obvious, just enough for silence to exist where it shouldn't. Or when she would look at me while I wasn't talking, not in a way that felt invasive, but thoughtful, as if she was observing something she couldn't quite place. I always told myself it meant nothing. It was just politeness, just maturity, just the natural way adults look at younger people. Still, there were small details that stayed longer in my mind than they should have. The way her dupatta would shift softly when she turned around the kitchen corner. The gentle rhythm of her voice when she called out for her son. The calm control in her expressions, even when she smiled. Everything about her felt balanced between presence and distance. Safe, but strangely unforgettable. And I never questioned it further. Because in my mind, she was simply my friend's mother. Someone older. Someone respectful. Someone untouchable in the emotional sense. That's what I believed. That's what I told myself every time I left the house and stepped back into my own life. But looking back now, I realized something I didn't understand at the time. Some people don't enter your life loudly. They don't arrive like storms or dramatic moments. Sometimes they exist quietly in the background until one day you realize they were never just background at all. And that realization always begins long before you notice it. It happened on an ordinary evening, one of those days that didn't feel important while it was happening. My friend had stepped out of the room, leaving me alone in the living space for a few minutes. The house felt quieter than usual, like it had shifted into a different mood the moment his footsteps disappeared down the hallway. I remember sitting there without thinking much, my phone in my hand, but not really looking at it. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't empty either. It felt aware, like the house itself was listening. That's when she appeared. Not dramatically, not suddenly, just naturally, like she had been there the whole time, and I had only now noticed. She was holding a tray with a cup of tea. Steam rose gently into the air, carrying that familiar scent. Cardamom mixed with something warm and comforting. The kind of smell that makes a space feel softer without you realizing why. "Tum ubbi tak yahin ho," she said quietly, her voice calm, almost amused. I nodded, standing slightly out of habit, but she gave a small motion with her hand, telling me to sit. So I did. And then came a moment that didn't feel important at first, but later refused to leave my memory. She placed the cup on the table in front of me. Her fingers touched the edge of the table just a little longer than necessary. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to notice. A fraction of a second of stillness. Her eyes lifted briefly toward mine as she straightened up. It wasn't a stare. It wasn't intense. It was something quieter, like she was checking something she didn't fully understand herself. Then she looked away. "Tum hair exams cab hain?" she asked, as if resetting the conversation. We talked normally after that. Simple things. Future plans. Studies. Life. The usual topics that don't carry weight when spoken out loud. But something inside me wasn't fully in that conversation anymore. because I had started noticing her differently. The way she held herself when she stood near the doorway, slightly leaning against the frame for a second before moving again. The soft control in her movements, like someone who had learned to never rush even when time demanded it. And the way she would pause, just briefly, before answering me. Not hesitation, something closer to thoughtfulness mixed with restraint. At one point, she asked me what I wanted to become in life. It wasn't an unusual question. Adults ask it all the time. But the way she asked it felt different. She didn't sound like she was making conversation. She sounded like she actually wanted to understand. There was a quiet seriousness in her voice that made me look up more carefully than I intended. And for a moment, our eyes met again. Just a second, maybe less. But it was enough for something to shift inside the atmosphere between us, something neither of us acknowledged. She quickly turned her attention back to the kitchen after that, adjusting something on the counter unnecessarily, as if the movement itself could reset the moment. I stayed still, holding the warm cup in my hands, realizing something I couldn't yet name. It wasn't attraction. Not yet. It wasn't understanding either. It was something in between, like awareness waking up slowly, noticing a presence it had always ignored before. And once that awareness begins, it never goes back to sleep the same way again. The rain started without warning that evening, as if the sky had been holding its breath all day and finally let go. It wasn't a light drizzle. It was a steady, heavy downpour that changed the entire rhythm of the house. The sound of it hitting the roof filled every silence, making conversations softer, slower, more thoughtful. My friend had left earlier than expected, caught up in something outside. I didn't think much of it at first. I was just waiting for the rain to calm down before heading out. But the weather didn't ease. It deepened, and so did the feeling inside the house. She came into the room holding a folded towel. Her presence felt slightly different this time. Less casual, more attentive. Like the rain had changed something in the way people moved through the house. "You're still here," she said gently, almost as if she already knew the answer. I nodded. Without saying anything else, she walked closer and handed me the towel. Our fingers brushed for a fraction of a second when I took it. It was nothing, and yet it stayed in my mind longer than it should have. The fabric was soft, slightly warm from being inside, and smelled faintly like the detergent she always used, clean, calm, familiar in a way that felt strangely intimate now. "Barish Ruk J. Tochail Jana," she added, adjusting the edge of her dupatta slightly as she stood near the window. I followed her gaze. Outside, the world was blurred. Streetlights glowing softly through sheets of rain, trees bending under the wind. Everything softened into shapes instead of details. She stood closer to the window than I expected. Not too close to me, but closer than before. The space between us didn't feel empty anymore. It felt occupied, like something invisible had settled there. And then, something small happened. She turned slightly while speaking, mid-sentence, and stopped. Not fully. Just a pause. A hesitation so brief it almost didn't exist. But I saw it. Her lips parted slightly, as if she had almost said something different. Something she chose not to say. Her eyes lowered for a moment before she finished the sentence in a calmer tone. I didn't ask what she almost said. I just listened, because something about the air between us had changed, and I didn't want to break it by naming it too quickly. When I returned the towel after a while, she reached for it, and our hands brushed again, slightly longer this time, still unintentional on the surface, but no longer unnoticed. She pulled her hand back first, a soft, almost invisible reaction, but her expression shifted just a little, like she had felt it too, even if she wouldn't acknowledge it. Neither of us spoke about it. Instead, she turned toward the kitchen, adjusting a cup on the counter that didn't really need adjusting. I noticed that small detail, the unnecessary movement, the subtle attempt to return things to normal. But normal wasn't fully there anymore. I could feel it. Something had cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough for light to start slipping through. And once that happens in a place, even silence doesn't feel the same again. The rain had almost stopped by late evening, but the house didn't return to its usual silence. It felt suspended, Like everything inside, it was waiting for something that hadn't arrived yet. The lights were dimmer now, not intentionally, just naturally, like the day itself was tired. Shadows stretched softly across the hallway walls, and the air carried that strange post-rain stillness where even small sounds feel meaningful. I was gathering my things near the entrance when I heard her footsteps behind me. Slow, controlled, familiar, but something about them felt different this time. "Tum jarahi ho," she asked. I turned. She was standing a few steps away, not too close, but not as distant as before either. Her expression was calm on the surface, yet there was something underneath it, something held carefully in place. "Yes," I said quietly. "Apalish whoop gai hai." She nodded, but didn't move immediately. That pause again, the kind that doesn't belong to conversation, but to thought. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The hallway felt narrower than it actually was, as if the silence itself had physical weight. The soft glow from the ceiling light touched the edge of her face, highlighting the quiet detail in her expression, the slight tension in her gaze, the way she seemed to be choosing her next words more carefully than usual. Then she stepped forward, just one step, not dramatic, not sudden, but enough to change the distance between us in a way that couldn't be ignored anymore. She stopped close enough that I could notice small details I hadn't paid attention to before. The gentle rise and fall of her breath, the faint scent of tea and fabric softener, the calm steadiness she usually carried now slightly disrupted by something unspoken. Her eyes didn't leave mine. And then her voice lowered, not in secrecy, but in something softer than speech. Almost like she was speaking to the space between us rather than to me directly. "I should not be saying this," she whispered. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They landed in the air like something irreversible, something that doesn't ask for permission before changing meaning. My mind paused, not because I didn't hear her, but because I did, completely. She didn't look away immediately after saying it. Instead, she held my gaze for a fraction longer than she should have. In that small stretch of time, everything felt suspended, like even the house was listening. Then, almost as quickly as she stepped forward, she stepped back, creating distance again, as if trying to correct something that had already happened. Her hand lifted slightly toward her dupatta, adjusting it unnecessarily, a familiar gesture, but this time it felt like control returning after a brief loss of it. Her voice returned to normal volume, but not her tone. "Take care," she said simply, as if nothing had changed. But everything had, because the sentence she whispered didn't explain anything. It didn't confess anything clearly. It did something more unsettling. It opened a door without showing what was behind it. I stood there for a moment longer than I needed to, not moving, not speaking, just realizing that some words don't end conversations. They begin new ones inside you that you can't easily shut off. And as I finally turned to leave, I understood something quietly, without needing it confirmed, that hallway would never feel the same again. Not because something happened physically, but because something finally slipped past silence and learned how to exist between us. The days that followed didn't feel different at first glance. Everything in the house continued as it always had. The same doors opened and closed. The same sound of dishes in the kitchen. The same soft rhythm of daily life that usually made everything feel normal without effort. But normal had quietly shifted into something more fragile, and I felt it in ways I couldn't explain out loud. Whenever I entered the house, my eyes instinctively looked for her, but not in a deliberate way. More like a reflex I hadn't chosen. And when I did see her, something inside me adjusted immediately, like a thought trying to behave properly in a space it didn't fully belong to anymore. She acted composed, more than composed, carefully unchanged. "Chai," she would ask in the same tone as before, as if nothing had ever slipped between words in that hallway. But I noticed the details now. The way her gaze would briefly meet mine and then move away a little faster than before. The way she would pause for half a second before speaking, as if testing whether her words still belonged in the same version of reality. Even silence between us had changed shape. It wasn't empty anymore. It was structured, like something carefully placed to avoid breaking. One afternoon, I stayed longer than usual. My friend was asleep upstairs, and the house felt quieter than it should have been. She was in the kitchen, preparing tea again. I stood near the doorway, unsure whether to enter or leave, and she didn't immediately turn around. But I knew she was aware I was there. That awareness itself felt different now. Not casual, not distant, something in between. Tum sugar thick lagdi hayab, she asked without looking back. It was such a simple question, but it carried weight, not because of the words, but because of the way she spoke them. Controlled, measured, as if even ordinary sentences now required careful balance. Yes, I replied softly. She nodded once, then continued stirring the tea. The spoon made a slow, circular sound against the cup. Steady, repetitive. A sound that should have been ordinary, but somehow felt louder than usual in the quiet kitchen. At one point, she stopped stirring, just for a second, and in that second, I thought she might turn around fully. Say something else, something closer to what had been left unsaid. But she didn't. Instead, she resumed stirring, slightly slower this time, like she was reminding herself of rhythm, like rhythm itself could keep emotions from spilling into words. When she finally handed me the cup, her fingers didn't linger this time. They didn't need to. That absence itself felt intentional. A correction, a boundary quietly reinforced without being spoken. But what unsettled me more was this. Even that distance didn't erase what had already been felt. It only shaped it into something quieter, something harder to point at. Later, as I sat in the living room, holding the warm cup, I realized something uncomfortable but clear. We were both pretending. Not that nothing happened, but that whatever happened could be placed neatly behind normal conversation again. And the hardest part was knowing that neither of us fully believed that anymore. It happened on an evening that looked completely ordinary on the surface. No rain, no urgency, no reason for anything to feel different. My friend had gone out again, leaving the house quieter than usual. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty, but aware. Like every sound would be noticed, even the ones we didn't make. I didn't plan to stay long, but I did. And so did she. She was sitting in the living room when I walked in, not doing anything in particular. Just there, a book resting loosely in her hands, not fully read. The light from the lamp beside her softened her face in a way that made the room feel more intimate than it should have been. For a moment, neither of us spoke. That silence wasn't like before. Before, silence had been background. Now it felt like something active, something shared. I sat across from her, keeping a respectful distance, but even that distance felt different than it used to. It no longer felt like separation. It felt like awareness of separation. She closed the book slowly, placing it beside her without looking at it. Then she folded her hands in her lap. A small gesture, but tighter than usual, like she was holding something in place. "Tum thick ho?" she asked. A simple question, but her tone wasn't casual. It carried something softer underneath. Not concern exactly, something closer to care that had to be measured carefully before being expressed. "Yes," I replied, and then nothing followed. But this time, the silence didn't break. It stayed. It expanded. She shifted slightly in her seat, but didn't look away immediately. Her eyes stayed on me a moment longer than necessary, and I could see it clearly now, the hesitation she tried to hide behind composure, as if she was standing at the edge of thought she had decided not to complete. I opened my mouth once, closed it again, because anything I could say felt either too much or not enough. The air between us felt heavier now, not uncomfortable, but charged with everything we weren't addressing. At one point, she lowered her gaze briefly, then looked back up. That small movement felt like a decision being delayed or avoided. I noticed her fingers loosen slightly in her lap, then tighten again. Small signs of internal conflict she would never allow to become visible in words. And in that moment, I realized something quietly unsettling. We were both aware of the same thing. Completely aware. But neither of us was willing to give it language. Because language makes things real in a way silence can still deny. Finally, she spoke again. Not about what was between us, but around it. "Zindagi kabi kabi, simple nahi hodi," she said softly, almost to herself. I nodded. even though the words felt heavier than they should have. There was no resolution in that moment. No confession, no crossing of lines. Only understanding, unspoken, incomplete, but present in every pause, every glance, every carefully controlled breath. When I eventually stood to leave, she didn't stop me, but she also didn't immediately look away. And in that brief moment before I turned fully toward the door, I felt it clearly. Nothing had been said between us, but everything had already been understood. Time didn't fix what happened between us. It simply softened it. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, the house returned to its familiar rhythm. The sound of footsteps in the hallway, the faint smell of tea in the mornings, the gentle routine of conversations that stayed safely on the surface. But something underneath that routine had changed permanently. Not broken, not healed, just understood. I stopped searching for meaning in every glance. She stopped pausing in the same places she used to pause. And yet, there was a new kind of awareness that remained between us, quiet, steady, and unspoken. We learned how to exist inside it without letting it spill over. One afternoon, I was leaving after a short visit when she called me near the doorway. Not urgently, not dramatically, just softly. "Sun low," she said. I turned back. She was standing slightly to the side of the hallway light, which softened her presence in a way that made her look even calmer than usual. Her expression was composed, but not distant. For a moment, she didn't speak. Then she stepped a little closer, not into my space, but near enough that the distance between us felt intentional rather than accidental. She lifted her hand slightly and gently adjusted the edge of my collar. It was such a small gesture, but it carried weight, not because of intensity, but because of care controlled with restraint. Her fingers were careful, light, precise, and for a second, she didn't pull away immediately after finishing. Just a fraction longer. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to feel it clearly. When she finally stepped back, her hand returned to her side slowly, as if letting go of something that didn't belong to be held anymore. Our eyes met. This time, there was no confusion in them. No searching, no hositashchen, only something quiet and settled. Understanding, acceptance, the kind that doesn't require explanation anymore. "Apna Kyle Rakna," she said softly. I nodded, and for the first time, the silence between us didn't feel heavy. It felt complete. I turned to leave, and she didn't stop me, but she also didn't turn away immediately. I could feel her presence behind me even as I reached the door, not emotionally pulling, not asking for anything, just existing there in a way that acknowledged everything without needing to say it again. Outside, the air felt normal, but I knew I wasn't carrying the same version of myself anymore. Because some experiences don't turn into relationships. They don't turn into endings either. They turn into something quieter, something internal, a memory that doesn't fade but settles, something that teaches you that not everything meaningful is meant to grow. Some things are only meant to be felt deeply once and then carried respectfully for the rest of your life. And as I walked away from that house, I finally understood. Nothing between us was ever loud enough to change the world around us. But it was always strong enough to change the way I saw it.